keep going. So last week we ended the week with talking about kind of the end of the Civil War. So just to refresh, I'm not sure if any of you were in social studies class or not on Thursday, but just talking about the Civil War in real general terms. The South, the southern states left the United States, slavery, and ultimately the two sides fought it out. The North was victorious, and then the United States eventually came back together, and the South and the North reunited back as the United States. So I have it up on this slide just because this is kind of the very, very end of the Civil War. So as the war ends, we have President Abraham Lincoln doing a couple famous things. First, issuing the Gettysburg Address, which was a speech that he gave the soldiers at the commemorating the final battle at the end of the war. Honored the troops that died, and so that was a famous speech of his. And then from a policy standpoint, or from a lawmaker standpoint, the other important piece here is the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order, so a law put into being by the president. And executive orders, remember, are laws that the president can enact without the aid of Congress. They don't need congressional oversight to issue executive orders. And the executive order issued by Lincoln made slaves in all states free. Okay, so those are kind of the two big things that I want to address before we go on to talking about after the Civil War. Today, we're going to spend class talking about the Reconstruction. And so the term Reconstruction just applies to the rebuilding of the South. Okay. So I mentioned this briefly last week, I believe, but the majority of, and maybe it's faster, let me see if I can just quickly. Whoa. That's the slide. Okay. So I just wanted to go back to this slide real quickly to illustrate kind of the point of why talking about Reconstruction is kind of important here. But ultimately, if you look at this map here, notice all of the battles, right? So all of the red explosion symbols, or whatever you want to call those are all the different battles that were fought in the Civil War. Okay? The vast, vast majority of those battles were fought where? Right? In the southern states. And so the reason that's important is when you wage war and you have these huge battles, you know, with hundreds of thousands of people dying, right? And damage done to buildings and roads and bridges. The South was basically left in ruin. Whereas the North, because the battle wasn't fought there, didn't have the same amount of damage, or didn't have really any damage to speak of until once the war was over. The North kind of just resumed life as usual and kind of picked up where they left off, which was already ahead of the South in terms of economic, right? The North was big businesses, industry, factories, whereas the South is primarily agricultural. Right? So on top of all of this damage, you also have damage to farms, right, where people grew tobacco, people grew cotton, sugar, right? So all of these big crops, right? Again, the South had to kind of start all over, and on top of that, right, they also had to replace slaves with people that they needed to pay to work their plantations. And so you have a huge economic hurdle for the South to kind of get over. Okay, and so that's why Reconstruction is kind of important. So Reconstruction lasted 10 or 12 years, right? So there was a long period of time after the war was over where the North actually placed severe restrictions on what the South could do, right? And they actually had Northern troops posted in southern cities and southern towns, making sure that everyone complied with all of these restrictions. So it kind of led to fueling the animosity between both sides. Even though the war was over and the South lost, right, there was still this sense of the North thinks they're better than us. The North's trying to control everything we're doing. And so you just had this tension back, right? And then I see that typo there. President Lincoln was definitely not assassinated in 1965. That would be 1865. Okay, and so that was a major point in the kind of post-Civil War era of Reconstruction, which was President Lincoln's assassination. All right, but let's look more to the point of kind of what I want to talk about. This graph down here at the bottom. Okay, so if you see this graph, and again, if you have questions, I'm just kind of pushing along, but if you have questions, please make sure you mention them in the chat or message me privately, and also make sure everyone signs in with Caleb so that we can log attendance. All right, but anyways, back to this chart. The blue is the North, and the gray is the South. So you just can kind of see the kind of general difference between the two. So population. The North accounted for 71% of the nation's people, of the nation's population, as opposed to only 29% of the South, right? You had way more people living in the North. Right? Railroad mileage, you had 72% of the railroads in the North, only 28% in the South. So why is that important? Well, so at the time, railroads were kind of the key to everything economic, right? The boom in railroads led to, first of all, just a massive movement west, because it was much easier to get to move west once there were railroads, as opposed to prior to that, where you were, talking about wagons. But the railroad mileage is important because in the North, you have this massive infrastructure of railroads where you can move goods, services, people, right? And you can move all those things easily. Whereas in the South, everything's more spread out. There isn't nearly the amount of railroads. And so just transportation is a bigger issue in the South, and it isn't as easy to get from place to place. People are more isolated. Iron and steel production, huge proportion of that happened in 92% of the U.S. iron and steel production was in the northern states, whereas 8% was in the South. So that kind of ties into the railroad because the iron and steel boom kind of coincided with the railroad. Wealth, same thing. We kind of keep going down the line, and the same thing kind of holds true in all of these things. The North had the majority of the people. They also had the majority of the money. 75% of the nation's wealth was accounted for by northern people in the North, as opposed to 25%. Value of exports. This is so way back when we talked about the Revolutionary War, where we rebelled against England. Part of the issue was that the colonies were only allowed to export raw materials back to England. And raw materials have less value than finished products, right? So the same thing was happening in the North and the South. In the South, you had all these raw materials that were exported, meaning shipped off to other places, and money received, right? So you had tobacco, not necessarily cigarettes, or cigars, but just bushels of tobacco, right? Raw tobacco, that was exported. Cotton, same thing, right? Cotton was exported from the South. Those are all things that are important, were important to the economy, and they generated a lot of money for those people, but they were still less valuable than the finished product, right? So for example, cotton is needed for lots of things, but think about the things we make cotton, or we use cotton to make, right? Clothing, bedding, all of that stuff. Those things, the finished products, right? The clothes, sheets, blankets, those are what are more expensive. Raw cotton's cheap. And so you have the North basically taking all these raw materials and making them into finished products in their factories and then exporting them for even more money. And so you see this disproportionate gap starting to widen between the North and the South. Again, same thing with factories. You have 85% of the factories in the North, so kind of all that stuff aligns. And then on the flip side of that, 84% of large farms are in the South because the climate's better there, and that's what their economy is geared towards, right? And so the damage from the Civil War was disproportionate hard on the South, on the southern states. So that's, I guess, the point of kind of what I'm trying to drive home is that after the war was over, the animosity didn't go away. If anything, it grew, and the gap between the two sides kind of widened. Even though they kind of all came back to the same country, right? The South very much felt inferior to the North, or they felt like the Northerners were rejected. So, so what you had during this period is this kind of back and forth tug of war between the North and South. So the war is over and slavery is outlawed. So the 13th Amendment is passed, that ends slavery. The 14th Amendment is passed, requiring equal treatment of all people, right? 15th Amendment allowed all people to vote, at this time, all men, so African American, white, didn't matter, right? All men could vote, but women couldn't yet vote until early 1900s. So again, you have the northern states enact all of these or pass all these amendments to the Constitution, kind of ensuring people's equality. But then on the other side of this, you had the southern states kind of doing things to not break those laws, but kind of manipulate them to favor white people and to disadvantage African Americans, right? Because they were bitter over the fact that slavery was over. So you had Jim Crow laws enacted in the South. So a lot of the southern states said, okay, you northern people said we have to provide equal treatment. Well, then we're going to provide separate but equal treatment. In other words, you get an equal quality school, but you have an all-black school and you have to go to that, or right. And so you had this segregation that was legal at the time because the justification was that it was, even though it was separate, they were separating everyone, they were still quote unquote equal treatment, right? Then you had stuff like literacy tests and poll taxes, and that was strictly designed to favor and to discriminate against ex-slaves being able to vote, right? Because the 15th Amendment said all men could vote regardless of race, but then the southern states said, well, we're going to require our citizens to pass a literacy test before they vote, which at the time, if you were a slave, chances are very, very high you couldn't read because you weren't given materials to read, right? And you also had certain states enact poll taxes where you had to actually pay to vote. And if you were a slave and granted your freedom, chances are also pretty high that you didn't have any money or very much money because you spent most of your life working for nothing, right? So you had these southern states enacting laws that were, by the letter of the law of the U.S. Constitution, were deemed constitutional or legal at the time, right? But they kind of took the spirit of the law and kind of moved it to whatever way they want, right? And you still see that today with states. That's something that hasn't gone away, right? And then you also had like white supremacist groups like the KKK pop up after the Civil War, and then those are just some derogatory terms for carpetbaggers and scallywag. Just I don't even actually know why those are. But the point being, there was this kind of tug of war back and forth between the North and the South. So before we get to looking at some questions, kind of the Compromise of 1877 was essentially what ended the period that we consider to be called Reconstruction. So this was an informal, unwritten deal that settled presidential debate. So in 1876, part of the compromise was that Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was awarded the White House over Democrat Samuel Tilden in exchange for the removal of all Northern troops from the South. So at the time, and politics have since shifted quite a bit, right? But 150, 170 years ago, right? The southern states were largely Democrat, right? Whereas the northern states were largely Republican, very much split up. Today, it's anything flipped the other way, but that's another topic for a whole nother day, right? The landscape of politics has changed a lot since 1870. But at the time, again, the southern states were almost all Democrats, and the northern states were almost all Republican. And so you had this really close election, and you had the Southerners angry that the Democrat wasn't going to be awarded the White House. And on the same side, you had the North angry over the same thing. And so the compromise was that the northern states would get their Republican president, but in exchange for that, they had to take all their troops out of the South and leave them alone, essentially. And that's what they did. So that really ended this kind of Civil War period where you had, armed forces kind of everywhere throughout our country. So Compromise of 1877. All right, so let me stop this right here. I'm going to pull up a couple things. Questions, but I want to, before we get to the questions, and hopefully you can all see this. I'm going to zoom in. Okay, so before we get to the question, I want to read the paragraph that the book actually has when it comes to talking about Reconstruction, because it's mentions a couple things I didn't talk about. So it lasted 12 years, and again, it was federal troops overseeing the rebuilding of the South. So it was essentially northern troops that oversaw the rebuilding of roads, bridges, buildings, schools, right? All those things, right? And those troops were overseeing this. That was the period we call Reconstruction. So schools were established for the former slaves who were all freed. And again, I didn't mention this, but you had a sharecropping system which was enacted in the South, which kept black farmers enslaved economically, which was, and to use the word enslaved is, they were technically not slaves, right? But they were similar to the indentured servants we talked about way back, right? So they were basically still working for very little, right? And then again, we talked about the different laws and political things that the people of power in the South enacted to prevent African Americans from really getting the equal treatment that the 14th and 15th Amendments were designed to, right? So with that, let's do just a few of these practice questions. We did 1 and 2 last week. Let's look at number 3. Doesn't talk about Reconstruction, but it talks just kind of about the Civil War and compares it to the Vietnam. So hopefully you can see this okay. If not, I'll go ahead and read it. It says, in the mid-1950s, the country of Vietnam was divided. There was a communist government in the north and a non-communist government in the south. The two fought for control of Vietnam. In 1975, ultimately the communists won, and Vietnam was united under communist government. So the question says, and again, as always, this is a good example of something that you don't need to know anything about the Vietnam War. Everything that you're going to be asked about the Vietnam War is going to come right from that paragraph. Don't panic if this is something that doesn't sound familiar. It says, because both wars blank, the Vietnam War and the U.S. Civil War can be said to share some similarities. Okay, so we're looking for which one of these 4 things did the 2 wars have in common? The Vietnam War, as it's mentioned in the paragraph, and the Civil War, which we were just talking about a little bit today and last week. So our 4 choices are: involved racial conflict, saw the addition of new territory, upset the balance of power, concluded with the formation of new nations, concluded with the reunification of the nation. So, again, assume nothing about the Vietnam War that isn't mentioned in that paragraph. So a good example of that would be A, or the first one, involved racial conflict. You don't know if the Vietnam War involved racial conflict because it doesn't say it in that paragraph. It may have, right? But you don't know that. So don't fall for those traps, right? That's classic GED test question trick. Don't fall for that kind of stuff. You know the Civil War involved racial conflict. That's obvious, right? But it doesn't say anywhere on there about race playing an issue with the Vietnam War. So throw it out. Right? Same thing with the second one. Saw the addition of new territory upset the balance of power. Okay? There's nothing on there about new territory. It's just saying the country split in half, communists in the north, non-communists in the south. That's all we know. So throw that one out too. So we know it's going to be one of these last 2. Either concluded with the formation of new nations or concluded with the reunification of the nation. So as long as we know what reunification means, then we should be okay. If we don't, then we're going to have to guess, right? But we can still figure it out, even if you don't know what that word means. So concluded with the formation of new nations. So let's look at the Civil War. The Civil War started out United States. The South left the United States and formed the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, and became their own country for a time being. And then the war ended, and then what happened? Did we end up with 2 different new countries? No. They came back together and reunited as the United States of America. Okay, so now let's look at Vietnam. Vietnam started out as the country of Vietnam, split apart, north and south. And at the end, it says Vietnam was united under this form of government, which implies Vietnam came back together. One country, same name, same country, same territory as it was before. Does that match concluded with formation of new nations or concluded with the reunification of the nation? And it's the last one. Reunification just means to reunite, bring back together. So there's your answer. All right, now let's look at a couple more. So let's zoom out here. I might have to zoom out pretty far here so that we can And this is a real low-res picture, so don't worry. You shouldn't really need to look at it closely. You'll get the idea. So, questions 4 and 5 refer to the following photograph of people who served in South Carolina's state government. Okay? And it says, which of the following is a fact confirmed by information in the photograph? Okay, so we're not looking for a conclusion. We're not looking for an assumption. We're not looking for something that's plausible. We're looking for which one of these things is factual that we can confirm just based on looking at the picture. Okay? Keep that in mind as we read through this. A, Southern Democrats were treated very well during Reconstruction. Is that a fact that you can prove based on looking at a picture? No. Okay? B, it was unfair that former Confederate soldiers could vote during Reconstruction. Okay? Well, first of all, that's an opinion, right? It's stated the way it's stated. Even if it was something that we could not prove, but even if it was something that this picture gave us some information about, the way it's worded, it's not even a fact to begin with. It's an opinion. He isn't right either. Okay? Again, we're just looking for something that we can prove is true based on this picture. C says, in 1868, many African Americans served in the government of South Carolina. Okay? You look on this picture and find numerous African Americans. Yeah. So C seems logical. And then lastly, D, the most qualified leaders in South Carolina government in 1868 were African Americans. Okay. Again, that could be true. We prove how qualified people are based on looking at a picture. No. Right? So the only one of these things that is a fact that we can say, yes, this picture shows us that that is true, is C. Right? So not a very exciting question, but again, knowing the difference and being able to weed out the difference between fact, opinion, and conclusion is critical on the social studies test, the reading test, the science. If you can get that concept down, it's going to help you out on all of those tests. Okay. And then the last question, and then we'll stop for the day. We're right about on time here. I'll zoom out a little bit more, and hopefully that's not too far. But number 5 says, now they're asking about conclusions, not facts. It says, which of the following conclusions is supported by the photographs and the passage on page 432? Okay, so if we need to go back, let's read the question first, and if I need to go scroll up and look at and find some information in the previous page, then let's do it. It says, A, over the course of Reconstruction, African Americans in the South gained and then lost political power. Okay. B, over the course of Reconstruction, African Americans in the South lost and then gained political power. C, over the course of Reconstruction, whites in the South gained and then lost political power. D, in the early years of Reconstruction, African Americans served in government in each southern state. Okay, so now we know the picture. Let's go up and let's look and see we can find anything in here that helps us. And I'm going to guess it's in that paragraph that we read. And I'm going to also assume that the answer might lie in this question here. Whites who came back to power as Reconstruction ended in the South in the 1870s prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Okay, so I actually don't think anything in that paragraph really helps us answer this question. And so, without cheating, I'm not going to cheat here and look at the answer. I'm going to tell you what I would guess, and then I'm going to check it. So that way you know I'm not totally full when I do this. All right, so for me, if I was going at this, because I actually don't find any of these answers to be great. I think I know the right answer, but let's see. So A, over the course of Reconstruction, African Americans in the South gained and then lost political power. I'm not ready to throw out A yet. I think A is possible. I'm not necessarily sure I'm convinced it's the right one, but I'm going to keep it for now. B, over the course of Reconstruction, African Americans in the South lost and then gained power. I don't think African Americans came out on top gaining any power. So I'm going to go ahead and say B, I don't think. And C, over the course of Reconstruction, whites in the South gained and then lost political power. Same thing here. I don't think whites ended up losing power at Reconstruction. That doesn't sound like the history that I have in my head of the way things went in the South. Okay? So I'm throwing out B and C. And I'm leaving it down to A. Over the course of Reconstruction, African Americans in the South gained and then lost political power. And D, in the early years of Reconstruction, African Americans served in government in each southern state. Okay, so again, we're not looking for a fact, we're looking for a conclusion. I think D sounds slightly better to me than A, right? It seems more reasonable to expect that in the initial years after Reconstruction, African Americans served in government, whereas A is implying that African Americans gained a bunch of power and then lost it. I don't know, that could be right, but D sounds like a better answer to me. So let me see. Let me see if I'm bum on this one or if I'm good. Let's find out. So I'm kind of nervous. I don't usually do this. Usually I cheat and look at the book off the screen. All right. So find my U.S. history, lesson 2. And in this case, teacher is wrong. So they go with A. And here's their reason. So that was a good exercise in doing this because sometimes I get to questions I haven't done. And especially like something like this, I didn't think there was a great amount of information, and so I just made the best guess I could. I narrowed it down to the right 2 in the end. They say A is correct. The number of African Americans in the composite photograph of the South Carolina State Legislature indicates that near the beginning of the Reconstruction, African Americans had considerable political power. So and one thing that almost made me go with A, which is ultimately probably the reason it's the right answer, is that D mentions each southern state, whereas the photo is just of South Carolina, right? So I thought, it seems reasonable that based on this picture of South Carolina and what we've read, that it was likely that African Americans served in the government of each state. I guess that's an assumption that maybe I shouldn't have made. Whereas A is looking at things more big picture, and it's not necessarily as specific as D. So again, there you have it, just as kind of an exercise in how to go about answering these questions. Sometimes it's going to work out for you, and sometimes it isn't. But again, the last little tidbit I'll leave you with, and I know we're a couple minutes over, so I'll get out of here, is if you can better your odds on these questions, right, cut it in half, go from 25% chance to 50% chance of getting a question right, then you're going to succeed way more on the test, right? And that's really the bottom line. So hope that was helpful. Sorry for going a couple minutes late. I'll let you go, and I will see you next time. Okay, thanks everybody. Talk to you later.